The beggar's hands were trembling when he lowered himself onto the curb beside me. For a second, I thought he was reaching for my wallet. He wasn't. He was reaching for nothing at all. He was just looking at my face. And the first words he spoke would turn out to be the only honest thing anyone said to me in the worst 24 hours of my life. But before I tell you what he said, I need to tell you what kind of day delivered me to that exact patch of sidewalk. It was Lowell Avenue, 11:08 at night on a Thursday in March. I didn't end up there by accident. I ended up there because everything I had spent 15 years building had been taken from me in a single span of daylight, one piece at a time, like a man being dismantled by appointment. It started at 9 in the morning, fourth floor of Caldwell Rose Logistics in Columbus, Ohio. The company I had given 15 years to. The company where I started loading trucks at 26 and clawed my way up to operations manager. The company I had assumed, the way you assume the floor will be there when you swing your legs out of bed, that I would retire from. The man across the desk was named Brett Hullunga. He was 31. He had been with the firm for 14 months. He was wearing a watch worth more than my car. And he was holding a single sheet of paper with my name printed across the top. "Muckas, I'm going to be straight with you," he said. He used the voice people use right before they are anything but. "We've made the decision to consolidate your role. It's effective today. Today, HR is ready for you whenever we're done here. 15 years, 3,000 mornings clocking in before sunrise, covering shifts nobody else would touch, training every kid who ever came through that warehouse, including, as it happened, Brett Hullunga himself 11 months earlier." And now Brett was folding all of it into a severance envelope and a handshake he didn't actually extend. They walked me out at 9:34 in the morning. They let me carry a cardboard box. Inside it was a photo of my two kids. A chipped mug that read "World's Us Dad," the one my daughter Papa gave me when she was 6. And a stress ball shaped like a globe that I'd been squeezing through budget meetings for years. They took my badge. They did not shake my hand. I sat in my truck in the parking garage for 35 minutes. I watched Kukas I'd known for a decade walk past my windshield without seeing me, and I did not cry. Muckas Wub is not a man who cries in parking garages. I just sat there, feeling the strange weightlessness of a man whose name had just been peeled off the only identity he'd ever worn. I drove home. The house in Cluntonville that Paul and I had bought in 2016. The one with the crooked porch step I'd been meaning to fix for 4 years. Her car was in the driveway at 11:20 in the morning, which made no sense. Paul was a nurse and she worked Thursdays. I went inside thinking something was wrong. I was right, something was wrong. It just wasn't the kind of wrong I was braced for. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded. There was a manila folder in front of her. And she had the particular stillness of a person who has rehearsed a speech so many times that delivering it has become a chore. I didn't even get the chance to tell her I'd lost my job. I never got that chance at all, because before I could open my mouth, she looked up at me. Her eyes held no anger and no sadness, only the flat finality of a door already closed. And she said the 4 words that started the second collapse of the day. "We need to talk, Muckas." I have learned something about those 4 words. When someone you love opens with them, they are not inviting a conversation. They are reading a verdict. I sat down across from her because my legs had decided to sit down whether I authorized it or not. The manila folder sat between us like a third person at the table. "I lost my job this morning," I said. I had to say it to someone, and she was the only someone I had. "I know. You know, it happened 2 hours ago." Ranuta texted me. "Her husband still works in your building." She slid the folder a 1/4 inch toward me. The gesture was so small and so practiced that I understood she had imagined this moment many times. "It actually makes this easier to say now." "Makes what easier?" She took the kind of breath people take before they jump off something. "I've been seeing someone for about a year. His name is Gerpt. I'm not going to lie to you about it anymore. And I'm not going to pretend the timing is kind, because it isn't. I want a divorce." The kitchen tilted, not violently, just enough to notice. The way a room shifts when you stand up too fast and the blood hasn't caught up to your head. A year, while I was covering Saturday shifts so we could afford the kids' braces. While I was driving to Cleveland for the regional meetings, she said she was proud of me for landing. A year of Gerpt, layered underneath a year of my life. Like a second floor I never knew the house had. "A year," I said. "It was the only piece I could pick up." "Who is he?" "It doesn't matter who he is. It matters to me. He's an anesthesiologist at Riverside. We met at work." She said it without flinching, and that was the part that hollowed me out, not the affair itself, the steadiness of her hand as she confessed it. I've already talked to a lawyer. The folder has the preliminary paperwork and muckas. I think it's best if I take the kids for now. Papa and Thea are at my mother's. I picked them up from school early. I told them you and I are going to be living apart for a while. You picked them up from school. You told them before you told me. I told them yesterday. That was the moment the day stopped being a series of events. It became something else. Something with a current to it, pulling me toward a destination I couldn't yet see. My wife had told my children that our family was ending a full day before she told me. And she had done it while I sat in a budget meeting, squeezing a globe-shaped stress ball, believing the floor was still under my feet. Why? I asked. It came out smaller than I meant it to. Just tell me why. She looked at me for a long moment, and I will spend the rest of my life replaying what she said next, because she didn't say it to wound me. That would have been easier to forgive. She said it the way you state a fact you've grown tired of carrying. Because being with you started to feel like watching a man wait for a life that was never going to show up. Gerpt knows what he wants. You've spent 15 years hoping someone would notice you. I can't keep waiting around to see if you'll ever become more than the guy who opens the warehouse. Then she stood. She picked up a duffel bag that had been sitting by the back door the entire time. A duffel bag she had packed before I ever walked in. And she carried it to her car. I followed her into the driveway. I don't know why. Maybe a part of me thought there was still a sentence I could say that would reverse the morning. There wasn't. I stood on the crooked porch step I had never fixed, and I watched her taillights turn the corner onto Undanulla toward her mother's house, where my two children were already waiting for a future that didn't have me in the center of it. Then I went back inside, into a house that had gone quiet. In the specific way houses go quiet when the people who made them loud have just driven away. I walked through the rooms the way you walk through a place you're seeing for the last time, even though I held the deed. Even though the mortgage was in my name. Thea's room came first. My son was 9 and his room was a museum of 9. A bin of Legos sorted by no system I had ever understood. A poster of a soccer player I couldn't name. A nutlut shaped like a rocket that he still wanted on, even though he insisted to his friends that he didn't. His backpack was gone. His favorite hoodie was gone, the gray one with the frayed cuff he chewed when he was nervous. Paul had been packing in pieces, I realized. The leaving had been happening for weeks inside my own house, while I slept beside the architect of it. Papa's room was the same kind of empty. My daughter was 12. Old enough to have opinions about which version of her parents she got to keep. Her reading lamp was still there, but the books were gone off the shelf. And there was a clean rectangle in the dust where her jewelry box used to sit. The one I'd bought her at a craft fair because she'd held it for 10 minutes and then put it down, and I'd gone back the next morning while she was at school to buy it as a surprise. She'd taken it. At least she'd taken it. I sat on the edge of her bare bed. And I did not cry, I told you. I'm not a man who cries. But I felt the specific hollowness of a person who has lost, in the span of a single morning, 2 things he had built his entire interior architecture around. My job, which had told me what I was worth in dollars. My marriage, which had told me what I was worth as a man, both revoked before lunch, and the Krelps part wasn't the loss. It was that both of them, the company and the wife, had used almost the same word to do it. Consolidate, wait around. Neither one of them had said I was bad. They had said I was unnecessary, which is so much worse because you can argue with bad, you cannot argue with unnecessary. By 9 o'clock that night, I could not stay in the house. The silence had developed a texture, a kind of pressure that built in the corners of the rooms and pushed against my chest. I couldn't call my parents. My father, Donald, lives in a retirement community in Fort Muzz. He communicates exclusively in forwarded news articles and one-line texts. My mother passed in 2019. I couldn't call my friends either, because when I went through the contacts in my phone at the kitchen table, I realized something. Almost every name in the couple friends category belonged to Paul's orbit. 15 years of marriage, and I had outsourced my entire social life to my wife. Now that she had left, the friendships had left with her. Repossessed. Like furniture, I'd only been leasing, so I got in the truck. I didn't have a destination, I just had a need to be in motion, because motion was the only thing that felt like the opposite of what was happening to me. I drove north on High Street, west on Hudson, no plan and the radio off because every song felt like an accusation. I ended up on Lowell Avenue, a stretch I never had reason to drive. In a part of the city where the storefronts had steel shutters and the streetlights buzzed with that orange glow that makes everyone look like they're already a memory, there was a diner there, the Crescent, a narrow place open all night with a hand-painted sign and condensation fogging the windows from the inside. The kind of warmth that pulls at a man who is freezing from somewhere a coat can't reach. I parked. I almost didn't go in. I sat in the truck with my hands on the wheel for a long time, doing the math on a life that no longer added up. Then I went in, because the alternative was driving until the gas ran out. And I wasn't sure I trusted myself with where that thought was heading. What I didn't know was this. The man who would change everything was already outside, sitting against the brick wall by the door. The waitress was named Adut. She had the kind of face that had been pouring coffee for strangers at midnight for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by any of them. She didn't ask if I was okay. People who work the overnight shift at a diner learn to read a man the way a doctor reads a chart, and whatever she saw in me, she decided the kindest treatment was a thick white mug, a stream of black coffee, and 4 words of her own. "Sit wherever you want, sweetheart." Then she left me alone, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for me all day. I took the booth in the far corner, the one with a clear view of the door and the rain that had started sometime between the parking garage and now. I wrapped both hands around the mug, not to drink it, just to hold something warm. I stared out at Lowell Avenue and I tried to locate the exact moment my life had cracked. Was it this morning? Was it a year ago when Gerpt walked into Riverside Hospital? Was it 15 years ago when I decided that loyalty to a company was the same thing as a future? I couldn't find it. That's the thing about a collapse. By the time you're standing in the rubble, you can never point to the first stone that moved. That's when the door opened. It let in a gust of cold and the smell of wet pavement. And the man from the wall outside came in. He was old, somewhere past 70. He had a gray beard gone wild at the edges and a coat that had been a good coat once. A long wool overcoat, now dark at the cuffs and missing 2 buttons. He had a plastic grocery bag in one hand, the kind that holds a life when a life has been reduced to what you can carry. His shoes were wrong for the weather. Adut looked up and said, "Evening, Augustin." She said it the way you greet someone you know, and he nodded at her, and I understood that he was not a stranger here. He was a regular at a diner who came in from the cold and who Adut knew by name. He shuffled toward the counter, and then he turned to find a place to sit. And that's when he saw me. He stopped. Not the casual stop of a man choosing a seat. He stopped the way you stop when you've walked into a wall in the dark. His whole body went still. The grocery bag swung once and then hung dead at his side. He stared at my face across the length of that narrow diner, and the blood drained out of his own face until his skin matched the gray of his beard. Adut noticed. "Augustin, you all right, hun?" He didn't answer her. He walked toward me, slow, not to the counter where he clearly always sat, not to a booth of his own, directly to mine, and he stood over me for a second, and then he lowered himself onto the bench across from me without asking, his hands trembling, his eyes locked on my face, like he was looking at something that had no business existing. "Sir," I said. I didn't know what else to say to a homeless man who had just sat down across from me uninvited at 11 o'clock at night. "Can I help you?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again. His voice, when it finally arrived, was sandpaper and disbelief. "You have his face." I waited. The rain ticked against the window. "Whose face?" I asked. He didn't answer the question I'd asked. He answered a different one, the one underneath it, the one he'd clearly been carrying for longer than I'd been alive. "My grandson, you have my grandson's face." His eyes were wet now, not falling, just full, exactly his face, and I haven't seen that face in 26 years. I should have been afraid. A stranger telling me I wore the face of someone I'd never met is, by any reasonable standard, a reason to leave. But I didn't leave. I had nowhere to go and nothing left to protect. And there was something in the way the old man was shaking that told me this was not madness, this was grief, the kind that has waited a quarter-century for an audience, so I stayed, and he began to talk. "I know how I look to you," Augustin said. There was a strange dignity in the way he said it. A man fully aware of his own coat and his own grocery bag and choosing to speak as if neither one defined him. An old man living rough off his medication, seeing ghosts in a diner. I would think the same thing if I were you. So before you decide I'm crazy, let me show you something. He set the grocery bag on the seat beside him. He reached into the inside pocket of the wool coat, the one place a man with nothing keeps the thing he has left. He drew out a square of cardboard wrapped in clear packing tape, layer over layer. The kind of waterproofing you build when the object inside has to survive years of rain and pockets and nights against brick. He peeled back a corner with fingernails that hadn't seen a clipper in a long time. He slid out a photograph, he laid it on the table, and he turned it to face me. A boy, maybe 18, 19, standing in front of a chain-link fence with a bicycle, squinting into a summer sun. Grinning the careless grin of someone who has not yet been told that the world keeps a ledger. Dark hair pushed off his forehead, a jaw a little too strong for the rest of his face, and eyes set slightly wide, the kind of feature you don't notice until you've seen it twice. I had seen it twice. I saw it every morning in the mirror. I want to be careful about how I describe what looking at that photograph did to me because it would be easy to exaggerate, and the truth doesn't need exaggerating. It was my face, not a resemblance, not a family reunion. Oh, you two could be cousins. If you took the boy in that photo and aged him into his 40s, if you put the lines around his eyes that 15 years of early morning shifts will carve, if you threaded the gray through his temples that a divorce will accelerate, you would have the man sitting in the corner booth of the Crescent diner holding a cooling mug of coffee. You would have me. His name was Elias, Augustin said, my daughter's boy. I raised him after she passed, raised him from the time he was 4. He disappeared in the spring of 2000. He was 19 years old. Disappeared, I repeated. The word felt too small for the weight he gave it. He left for a job out west, said he'd found work on a fishing boat in Alaska. The kind of money a kid uses to start a life. He called me from a bus station in Spokane, told me he loved me, told me he'd send for me once he got settled. Augustin's thumb moved across the edge of the photograph, an unconscious motion, worn into him like a riverbed. That was the last time I heard his voice. The boat company had no record of him. The bus station had no camera footage that lasted that long. The police filed a report and then they filed it away. A 19-year-old who told people he was leaving for Alaska is not a missing child to them. He's a young man who left, case closed. And I never stopped. He said it flatly. Without self-pity, the statement of a man reporting weather. I looked for him for 26 years. I spent everything I had doing it. That's the part you're too polite to ask about. Why I'm sitting here in a coat with no buttons. I had a house once. I had a small business, a print shop. I sold all of it piece by piece, year by year. Hearing people who promised they could find him and never did. By the time I understood the searching had eaten my life, I had nothing left to search with. The looking is what put me on the street. I don't regret it. A man can lose a house. He cannot lose a grandson and call himself a man if he stops looking. He went quiet. Outside, a city bus hissed past, throwing wet light across the window. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Even if I have his face, I'm not him. I'm not even related to him. What do you want from me, sir? Augustin looked at me for a long moment, and then he told me. And it was not anything I could have braced for. I don't want money, Augustin said, which made me realize I had braced for exactly that, and I felt ashamed of bracing. A man in my position, that's what you'd expect. You'd expect me to use the resemblance, spin you a story, ask for $40 and a ride. I've watched people do it. I'd never do it with his face, never with Elias. Then what? He folded his weathered hands on the table. And for the first time since he'd sat down, the trembling stopped. I'm 78 years old, he said. I have a heart that the doctors at the free clinic tell me is running on borrowed time, and I believe them because I can feel it the way you feel a tire going soft. I have maybe a year, maybe less, and in that time I have one thing I want to finish. And I have never in 26 years had the one tool that might let me finish it, until tonight. Until you walked into this diner with a face that I have spent half my savings trying to get a forensic artist to draw for me. I don't understand what a face does. It opens doors, he said. Listen to me, most people who disappear and survive don't want to be found. If Elias is alive, and I believe in my bones that he is, he's living under another name somewhere. And he's been living that way so long, he might believe his own story by now. You don't find a man like that by knocking on doors and asking, have you seen this 19-year-old from 26 years ago? You find him by showing people what he looks like now, and I have never been able to show them that. The age progression software the police ran in 2010 gave me a stranger. The artist I paid in 2015 gave me a guess. But you, he stopped, his voice catching on the next word like cloth on a nail. You are the answer to a question I have been asking machines and strangers to draw for 26 years. And none of them ever got it right. And here you are, real, breathing, sitting in a booth. I sat with that. The coffee had gone cold between my hands. What is it you actually want me to do? I asked. Walk into the places I can't get into anymore, he said simply. I'm an old man in a torn coat. People look at me and they look away. Doors that would open for you slam in my face. But a man with Elia's grown face. A man who can sit across from a shelter director, a missing persons clerk, a fishing fleet records office and say I'm looking for someone who would look like me now. That man gets answers. I can't pay you. I have nothing. I am asking a stranger on the worst-looking night of his life, judging by your eyes, to give an old man a year of his face. He paused. I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to do a foolish thing for someone you owe nothing. I'm asking anyway. It's the only thing I have left to ask for. And here is the part I have never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't in that booth. By every measure that the morning had taught me, I was worthless. My company had consolidated me. My wife had told me in not so many words that 15 years of me hadn't added up to a man worth waiting for. I had walked into the Crescent diner believing the central fact of my life was that I was unnecessary, surplus. A part the world had decided to engineer out of its own machine. And then a destitute man who had lost everything, his grandson, his house, his print shop, his place in the warm world, looked across a diner table at the face I had spent all day being told was useless. And he called it the most valuable thing he had seen in 26 years. I lost my job this morning, I heard myself say. My wife left me this afternoon. She took my kids to her mother's. I don't actually have anything to go back to. Augustin didn't say he was sorry, he just nodded, slowly, like a man who recognized the shape of another man's ruin. Then maybe, he said, we found each other at exactly the right time. I told him I needed to think, which was the truth, and also a thing men say to buy time when a decision frightens them more than it should. He understood. He told me where I could find him in the daytime. A public library on Whittier that let him sit in the reading room as long as he kept to himself. And a soup kitchen attached to a church on 4th that served lunch at noon. He didn't have a phone. A man who has sold his house to look for a ghost does not have a phone. He had a library, a church, and a face he was hoping I'd lend him. He left the photograph of Elias on the table when he stood, sliding it toward me with 2 fingers, and I understood it was deliberate. He trusted me to bring it back, which is a strange kind of faith to place in a stranger, except that I no longer felt entirely like a stranger to him, and he no longer felt entirely like one to me. Why leave me the picture? I asked. Because a man comes back for a thing he's holding, he said. And because if you don't come back, then at least the last person to see his face was someone who wore it. That's not nothing to me. Then he picked up his grocery bag and went out into the rain, and I watched through the fogged window as he turned up his collar and walked east on Lowell until the orange light swallowed him. I stayed in the booth until almost 2 in the morning. Adut refilled my cup 4 times without being asked, and never once told me it was time to go. At some point she set a slice of pie in front of me that I hadn't ordered. On the house, she said, you look like a man doing math. She wasn't wrong. I was doing math. The severance from Caldwell Rose would cover the mortgage for maybe 3 months. After that, the house I'd raised my kids in would have to be sold and split, because that's what divorce does. It liquidates the past into halves. My children were at Paul's mother's house being told a new story about their family. And there was a man named Gerpt who had been part of their lives in secret for a year and would now be part of it openly. There was no version of the next morning in which I woke up and resumed being who I had been the day before. That man had been consolidated. That man had been waited out and found wanting. That man was gone. So the question wasn't really whether I should help an old homeless man chase a grandson who'd vanished in 2000. The question was whether I had anything better to do with the wreckage of my life. And the honest answer, sitting in that booth at 2 in the morning with a stranger's grandson staring up at me from a photograph, was no. I had nothing better. I had nothing at all. And a man with nothing has a peculiar kind of freedom. He cannot lose what he has already lost. I drove home to a house that was no longer a home, just a building I owned that contained the indentations of furniture that wasn't there anymore. I slept badly on top of the covers in my clothes. And in the morning, I called the only person from work who had texted me a single line of decency after the news got around. A guy named Ruben who'd run the night dock. And I asked him a question I never thought I'd ask. I asked him whether in 15 years of moving freight across the country I had ever once felt like the work mattered, like the man doing it mattered, or whether I'd just been a reliable part in a machine that would replace me the second a younger, cheaper part came along. Ruben was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Muckas, you trained half the people in that building. You think any of them learned what they know from the company? They learned it from you. The company didn't make them good, you did. The company just took the credit." I hung up. I sat in the silent house. And then I drove to the library on Whittier. to find an old man and tell him yes, he was exactly where he said he'd be. At a table in the back of the reading room with a county atlas open in front of him and a pencil stub in his hand, marking something I couldn't see. When he looked up and saw me crossing the room, the photograph of Elias held out in front of me like an offering. His face did something I hadn't seen it do the night before. It softened. The grief was still there. It never left him. But underneath it, for just a second, was the thing Augustin had been living without for so long that it had nearly atrophied. Hope, the dangerous, expensive kind. "You came back," he said. "I came back, and I'm in. Whatever this is I'm in. I don't know what I'm doing, and I can't promise we find him. But I've got a face you say you need and a calendar that's suddenly very empty. And I'd rather spend it on something that means something to somebody than on watching my own life finish collapsing." He didn't celebrate. Men who have waited 26 years for things do not celebrate when those things finally arrive, because they have learned that celebration is a down payment grief will come to collect. He just nodded, closed the atlas, and said, "Then sit down, there's more you need to know before you say yes for real." What I learned over the next hour in the hush of that library reading room was this: Augustin's search had not been the disorganized flailing of a desperate man. It had been a campaign. He had a system. Inside the grocery bag he carried his entire life, and inside that, wrapped in another layer of taped cardboard, was a notebook. The third notebook, he told me. The first two had been lost to a flooded storage unit years ago. In it, in a careful hand that had not yet been ruined by age, were the names of every shelter, every records office, every fishing company in 3 states he had contacted, the dates he had contacted them, and the dead ends each one had produced. He had a map of Elias' last known movements drawn from the single phone call in Spokane. He had a list. And this was the part that turned my stomach over. A list of unidentified remains found in the Pacific Northwest between 2000 and 2010 that matched Elias' age and height. Each one crossed out with a date, each cross out. A morning Augustin had spent on a bus to a county morgue to look at the worst thing a grandfather can be asked to look at. And each one not him. 41 times, Augustin said, he followed my eyes to the crossed-out list. 41 times I went to identify a body, and 41 times it was someone else's grandson. I used to think the worst thing would be finding him dead. I was wrong. The worst thing is the 41 times you find a stranger's child, and you feel relief. And then you feel ashamed of the relief, because that boy on the table is someone's Elias too, and his someone never came. I didn't have an answer for that, there isn't one, so I did what I had learned to do in budget meetings when a number was bad and no words would fix it. I stayed in the chair, I didn't look away, I let the man have his grief in the company of someone who wasn't trying to talk him out of it. "Where do we start?" I finally asked. He turned the notebook toward me. He tapped a name near the bottom of a page. The most recent entry, dated only 2 months earlier. A boat captain named Hulawa, retired now, living in a town called Astoria on the Oregon coast. A man whose name had surfaced in an old crew manifest that one of Augustin's vanished investigators had unearthed a decade ago and never followed up on. Hulawa had run a salmon vessel out of Alaska in the spring of 2000. Hulawa might have laid eyes on a 19-year-old kid from Ohio who'd come looking for work and a fresh start. "He won't talk to me on the phone," Augustin said. "I tried, an old voice asking about a kid from 26 years ago. He hung up, but a man could drive out there, a man with the right face could sit across from him and ask in person." "That's 2,000 miles, I said. Augustin looked at me. "Do you have somewhere else to be?" I didn't, and we both knew it. We left 4 days later in my truck. Because Augustin had no car and I had no reason to stay, I'd called Denpol to tell her I was leaving the state for a couple of weeks, and she'd been quiet on the line. Then she said, "The kids are going to ask where you are." And I'd said, "Tell them I'm helping someone find his family," which was true, and which I think surprised her, because the man she'd grown tired of waiting on wasn't the kind of man who drove 2,000 miles for a stranger. Maybe she was right that I hadn't been. Maybe a man only becomes that on the far side of losing everything that was holding the old version in place. The drive west took 3 days. Augustin talked the whole way, and I let him, because I understood by then that the talking was its own kind of search. Every story he told me about Elias was a way of keeping the kid alive. The boy who fixed neighbors' radios for free. The boy who cried at a movie and pretended it was allergies. The boy who left a bus station saying "I love you" and was never heard from again. He was keeping his grandson alive in the only place he was certain still held him, which was an old man's memory. Somewhere in Wyoming, he fell asleep against the window, and I drove through the dark with his entire life in a grocery bag at his feet, and I thought about how strange it was. The worst day of my life had delivered me to the passenger seat of a purpose I'd never have found on my own. Astoria was a gray town stacked against a gray river under a gray sky. The kind of place that smells like salt and diesel and rain that never fully commits to falling. Captain Hulloa lived in a clapboard house above the docks, and when he opened the door, he was exactly what 26 years of fishing leaves behind. A wide, weathered man, hands like cleats, eyes that had spent a career reading Water for Trouble. He looked at Augustin and saw an old man and started to close the door. Then he looked at me and he stopped. "I'll be damned," Hulloa said slowly. "You've got a face I know." The room went very still. Augustin's hand found the edge of the door frame. "You knew a kid named Elias," I said. It wasn't a question. "Spring of 2000, came up looking for work on a salmon boat, looked like me." Hulloa studied my face for a long moment, and 26 years moved behind his eyes. "Come in," he said. "Both of you. I've been waiting a long time for somebody to come ask." And I'd about given up that anybody would. What he told us, over coffee in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke, was not the answer Augustin had driven 2,000 miles to receive. But it was the first true thread in 26 years. Elias had worked Hulloa's boat for one season. He'd been a good hand. Quiet, careful, the kind of kid who learned fast and didn't complain. And then, at the end of that season, there'd been an accident on the water. Another crewman lost overboard in a storm off the Ullatuns. A man Elias had been standing next to one moment and reaching for the next, and the kid had never been the same after. He blamed himself, Hulloa said. Wasn't his fault, see takes who it takes, but he got it in his head that he'd let go too soon and he couldn't carry it. He didn't come back the next season. Last I heard, he'd taken a job inland under a different name, somewhere in Montana. Didn't want anything to do with the coast or the water or anybody who knew him from before. I always wondered if he had family somewhere wondering. Augustin made a sound I had never heard a person make, a single broken exhale. 26 years of held breath finally let go. "He's alive," he whispered. "You're telling me he was alive?" "He was alive in 2001, Hulloa said gently, unwilling to promise more than he knew. "After that, I can't say." But he didn't vanish off the earth, old-timer. He walked off it on purpose, carrying something too heavy for a kid. There's a difference. And a man carrying something can sometimes be talked into setting it down if you can find him. Montana, a different name, a grandson who hadn't disappeared but had buried himself alive under the weight of a guilt that was never his to carry. It was the thinnest of lids. It was also more than Augustin had held in a quarter of a century. We didn't find Elias. I want to tell you we did, because that's the ending the worst day of my life seemed to be steering toward. The kind of ending where the camera pulls back on a grandfather and grandson embracing in a Montana doorway. But I promised you the truth. And the truth is that the thread Hulloa gave us led to a town called Whitefish, and a man who'd worked a lumber yard there under the name Eli Sutter from 2002 to 2009. And then, to nothing. Eli Sutter had moved on, the way men move on when they've spent years learning to leave no trail. We were 1 decade and one more disappearance behind a ghost who had gotten very good at being a ghost. Augustin took it better than I did. I was the one who slammed the truck door in the lumber yard parking lot. He was the one who put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Muckas." He was alive in 2009. When we started this drive, he'd been dead in my heart since 2000. You understand what you've given me? You moved my grandson 9 years closer to now. Nobody has moved him an inch in 26 years, and you moved him 9 years in 1 week. He died that autumn, his heart, the soft tire he'd warned me about. He went in a bed at a hospice that I paid for with the last of my severance and didn't regret for 1 second, and I was in the room. And the last thing he said to me was, "Keep his face. Somebody might still need to recognize it." Then the old man who had lost everything and had taught me that a man is never as worthless as the worst day of his life insists, closed his eyes and was gone. I'm telling you this from the cab of a truck in a town in Montana, because I never went back to Ohio, not to stay. I sold the house. Dunpole got her half and married Gerpt in a ceremony I wasn't invited to, which is fine. Because I've stopped needing to be invited to a life that was never going to have room for me at the center of it. My kids visit in the summers now. Papa is 14 and thinks her dad's whole story is kind of insane but kind of cool. Thea is 11 and has decided he wants to help me look. I do still look. I run a small nonprofit now. funded by people who hear this story and feel something move in them, and we help families who can't afford private investigators search for people who walked off the earth on purpose, carrying something too heavy. We've brought 4 of them home. None of them was Elia's, all of them were somebody's Elia's. So let me ask you the question Augustine's whole life was built around. What would you do if everything that told you who you were was taken from you in a single day? Your job, which tells you what you're worth in dollars. Your marriage, which tells you what you're worth as a person. Both of them revoked before sundown. Both of them using almost the same word, unnecessary, surplus. A man not worth waiting for. Would you believe them? Would you carry that word around like a verdict you'd earned? Or would you find, maybe in a diner, maybe in the trembling hands of a man with nothing, that the people closest to you sometimes lose the ability to see you at all? And that it can take a complete stranger looking for someone else entirely to remind you what your face is worth? Because here's what that old man taught me. Your worth is not what the people who leave decide it is. Your worth is what you become when the old version of you is taken away. And somebody who has nothing left to give still looks across a table and asks for your help. I was consolidated on a Thursday morning. I was told I was a man not worth waiting for that same afternoon. And by the end of that week, I was the most valuable thing a grieving grandfather had seen in 26 years. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who's been told they were worthless and needs to hear that the next stranger who sits down at their table might be the beginning of something, not the end. Drop your answer to my question in the comments. I read every single one. And subscribe so you never miss another story. The booth is still there, so am I. I'll see you in the next one.